They want everybody else to do the same. So they're trying to observe that. So that's what. Wait, you picked up on it? Yeah.
Well, it was really that and Jerry Walker and his comment of, well, you know, if you want to design the school outlay with activities, I thought, yeah, then we have traffic at 5 o'clock.
Exactly. Yes, I thought about that one too. Well, I had between us, I had to tell them, you know, be careful about jumping. That's you got it. That's a relative issue. So you know, just stay neutral. Don't think there's some momentum there. Stay neutral until you know we get more feedback from more people. That's just one person that's got on the agenda, right? Well, so the focus group we were talking about was for the public affairs consultant. That's different than the master plan. So that master plan was on the focus group as a technical advisory committee. It's stakeholders who aren't residents for your presentation. That's different. That's for the public affairs consultant. I'll actually chime in when we get to that and distinguish it. Does that sound good?
For the study session?
For the study session.
Okay, we call this December 14th meeting of the Planning and Zoning to order. May we have the roll call, please?
Poland,
Here.
Kaplan, Lemaire,
Here.
Lucas,
Here.
Miles,
Here.
Miller is absent, and then Wyman.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Perfect. Past Chair Michael Mayor, will you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do we have any audience participation?
There's nobody signed up.
Okay, thank you. We have no audience participation. So, I know you have all looked at the consent agenda. Are there any changes, corrections to be made, or any motions for approval?
I move approval of consent agenda 5A.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a second. Any comments? Hearing none. All those in favor of the minutes, approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Against? The minutes are approved. So before we jump into our very special guest, Harry Lemaire, talking to us about the Highland Canal, I want to give a special thanks to Jennifer and to Mike, who served as both vice chair and chair and did a wonderful job. And thank you very much. And Earl and I have big shoes to fill. So
Thank you.
thank you for your service.
I had a half a term because of COVID. What's that work?
But you did well.
Thank you.
So we are pleased to have Harriet Lemaire, Executive Director of the Highland Canal Conservancy.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, Chair. Just your mic is off.
Oh, thanks for testing you on that. So welcome, thank you, and we're all eager to hear and learn from you.
Great. And I want to introduce Josh Phillips, the Director of Planning and Implementation. He is much more knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the stormwater transition and the plans. Not every detail, but he could probably identify a few outfalls in Cheerios Village for you if you were curious. I'm going to walk through just a little bit on the, pull this down. Is that too loud now?
No, that's
No,
fine.
no.
That's perfect.
I'm gonna walk through a little bit of just the history of the project and to make sure everyone's on the same page with the context of the project for the Highland Canal. And then we're gonna watch a very short video and then get into a little more detail on Cherry Hills Village. And then Josh can come up here and share more detail if that level is needed tonight. So our goal is to really build champions within the Cherry Hills Village community and each of the communities along the canal for this transformation, for the benefits that it provides for the community. So we're looking at all of you as potential champions. I think some of you may already be, so I'm eager to make sure that you're comfortable and knowledgeable. So the canal, quickly, I'm gonna go through these pretty quick. The canal was built in 1883, acquired by Denver Water in 1920, opened to recreation in 1970 through South Suburban Parks and Rec, being the first entity to do that. And we like to talk about last century's infrastructure, which that's the diversion up at Waterton Canyon, becoming this century's open space network. So that's the overall plan here for the Highland Canal. Our mission, we're about 7 years old now, is to preserve, protect, and enhance the Highland Canal in partnership with the public. In that partnership, we were empowered by the different jurisdictions in Denver Water to do planning for the Highland Canal, which is unusual for a nonprofit. The reason we were selected is because there's just too many different jurisdictions, so there needed to be one entity that could coordinate and organize the planning, and Denver Water didn't want to be the group to do that because they're not in the park planning business. So that's kind of how we got in this role. And so we created a community vision plan where over 5,000 people attended meetings and gave feedback, most of them in the southern communities and in central Denver. And then from that, we created a plan for the Highland Canal. And I'm going to quickly walk you through sort of the top line takeaways from what the plan for the Highland Canal said, just to give you context. So the first major piece of the plan, which is 380 pages long, I might just add, is caring for the 24,000 mature trees and planting a minimum of 50 new trees per mile along the canal. The right type of trees for the right environment is a critical part of that. Access and signage, we need much better wayfinding on the Highland Canal. You're starting to see some of this happen. 71 new mile markers, 200 plus wayfinding signs, new trailheads, improved access points, really improving the access and the signage to the canal. Interpretive signs will come too in the years to come. Crossing safety and enhancements, 7 new underpasses, if not more. 20 improved crossings, 5 trail gaps, major trail gaps in the Highland Canal connected. There's some 86 at-grade crossings. The safety of those crossings, we have a few of those in Cherry Hills Village. And the enhancement, you guys are doing a really good job. We are doing a really good job with that, I think, here. Neighborhood improvements. So there's a number of areas along the canal that are very different. And so the planners came up with certain areas that, because of the demographics and the needs and the opportunities, were identified for deeper investment. So there's benches, which are pretty straightforward, picnic areas, but also 15 new community spaces in areas where there needs to be activation and enhancement. So you don't see that many of the community spaces in the southern suburbs. You tend to see those more way up north and then way south. And then we get to the topic at hand tonight, stormwater management. And so just to step back a half sec, the stormwater idea for the Highland Canal for the canal to be transformed into a stormwater management system was something that came about like partway through the vision planning. It wasn't brought forward initially, although it had been on the back burners of the thoughts of urban drainage, Mile High Flood District, as it used to be called, and Denver Water for a long time. And once we started getting into the planning with the public, the idea was that it should be introduced as an idea because of the potential it had to provide water for the canal initially. And so there was a study done, a feasibility study done about 5 years ago, and the top line takeaways from the feasibility study were that if the entire Highland Canal, all the miles that are eligible for stormwater, were able to be transformed and utilized for stormwater management, that the canal would be wet some 100 more days a year. So not full, like Bill, you floating the canal, but, wet. So the base of it would be wet, which would be a huge benefit to the landscape and the environmental health of the resource. But then in addition, that the water that went into the canal, because of the filtration and then the ways that the canal works, could be some 40% cleaner before it was let out into natural waterways. So those were the initial takeaways, and you'll hear later in the presentation all the additional benefits that there are through that can be realized through this transformation. Some 92 water quality berms were imagined to be needed. You can see this beautiful graphic that shows the drainages that come, the water, I should call them watersheds that move across the canal. We'll get into that more. So I think right here is where I'm going to do the video. So you told me to, I'm going to go to the taskbar. Is that right? I'll just let you do it. Show you a quick video that sort of sums it up in a really beautiful and graphic way, and then we'll get into more detail.
Did you want this one?
Yeah, that one. Thank you.
From the foothills to the plains, the 71 miles of Denver's historic Highland Canal is a testament to an earlier generation's vision and hard work. But the canal is outliving its life as an irrigation utility.
Today, the role of the canal in metro areas is changing. The delivery of irrigation in that canal has historically been pretty inefficient. We know that we have to do everything we can to protect public health, which means protecting our environment. That means finding another source of water. So the Highland Canal Conservancy is working with Denver Water, with the jurisdictions, and with the community, most importantly, to help determine what the future of the canal will be.
That collaboration is reimagining the canal as a smart water system, using an inspiring model of stormwater management.
Stormwater is really any precipitation that comes from the sky, and anything that doesn't infiltrate runs off and becomes stormwater. By the very nature of how the Highland Canal was built, it basically cuts across drainage basins. So what that means is the areas that would normally drain into a natural drainage way, a channel, a river, gets intercepted by the Highland Canal.
The Highland Canal is uniquely situated to be able to have water being collected from these stormwater events and slowed down and retained for a certain time period before it is then released back to the natural streams. Denver Water and the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District commissioned a study of the canal to look at the opportunities and constraints for using the canal for stormwater management. Communities can use the master plan to assist them in identifying the risks, the costs, and facilities needed to be able to utilize the canal for stormwater management.
The Highland Canal Conservancy's mission is to protect, preserve, and enhance the Highland Canal. With the help of a grant from the Pisces Foundation, the Highland Canal Conservancy has been able to bring together all of the stakeholders and really facilitate the conversations that need to happen.
The result of all that collaboration and work is STEP, the Stormwater Transformation and Enhancement Program.
The purpose of STEP is to open up dialogue regarding stormwater in the canal and to break down barriers and to answer questions and concerns that, in particular, that the jurisdictions might have.
STEP will also allow communities to meet their local stormwater goals or environmental goals and provide a platform for future use of the canal.
STEP advances sustainable ways to manage stormwater through green infrastructure along key sections of the canal.
Green infrastructure is a way for us to mimic nature and the way nature manages stormwater runoff.
This has a host of environmental, economic, and social benefits, which includes not only reducing our flood risk and improving water quality, but it also improves air quality, reduces the urban heat island effect, and improves our resiliency to climate change. Urbanization contributes to some pollution of our waterways, and by building green infrastructure, it helps reverse that effect. And and makes our communities healthier.
2 projects are already underway as part of STEP. At Eisenhower Park, the focus is on water quality.
The Eisenhower project is a wonderful opportunity for the city and county of Denver to treat and filter stormwater runoff. That project will install 3 separate water quality berms or weirs within the canal. We also are installing things like inlet filters or vaults that will collect trash and sediment from the streets before they enter the canal. It allows that water to be held longer and promotes greater infiltration, which is better for water quality and also promotes better plant health.
At Greenwood Village, the primary goal is improving local stormwater management through use of the canal.
In older developments, the stormwater would naturally go into the Highland Canal as opposed to the natural stream. By formalizing the use of the Highland Canal for stormwater, it allows us to make local storm system improvements so that that flow gets more efficiently into the Highland Canal and reduces that flooding.
In a region that is facing more and more challenges with water availability, STEP offers smart water solutions that can bring new life to our regional legacy.
Without water, there likely isn't a future for the Highland Canal. Through repurposing the canal and through STEP, we get 100 more days of water along the canal. And increasingly, to have a 71-mile pre-infrastructure corridor is an asset that you have to protect.
The story of the canal in its beginning was like a promise of a better future. Those who used it were able to enhance their lives and enhance their property. This is a new way for us to bring that promise of a new future.
So we've been really lucky to get that funding from the Pisces Foundation and the, some urban water funder groups, some other groups that they brought together. Sort of unheard of to get 4 years of funding. It's a national model. This work is a national model of green infrastructure on a large scale. And it's not something that we went into when we created the Highland Canal Conservancy that we thought we'd be doing. We thought we'd be telling people that the canal was going to be dry. And so we're thrilled at this, but it's hard work. And so to talk a little more about it and what it means for Cherry Hills. This is just showing, I think you saw this in the video. I don't know if we need to repeat that, the 2 different. So here we are. So this is our community in Cherry Hills Village, and what's imagined is that in order to address flooding and manage stormwater in the canal, we made 5 water quality berms, 3 constructed overflows, and 1 spillway. So we'll be able to talk a little bit more about what these look like. The rough estimates in the master plan that'll be refined through the work that you all are doing was around $800,000. We may find that some of those amounts are able to go down, just depending on what goes on upstream and how they're designed and so forth. And so the next image is just showing the different sections of the Highland Canal that are being transformed. You can see if you kind of do what Bill's doing, close, it's kind of tight, but you can see that there are, I think it's 7 different sites with pilots. I might have the number wrong, but I think we're hoping to get up to 17 miles of the Highland Canal that are transformed in different ways. So we're going to walk through some of those examples and show you some developments in Eisenhower and so forth. This is out in Douglas County. This is a new development that was led by Shay. It's called Solstice. It's an area where the Highland Canal, the land that was being developed or is being developed is on both sides of the Highland Canal. So they had a unique opportunity to come in and kind of reconfigure the canal too. Still was controversial with neighbors, but not the way that you would be doing that in communities like this. But you can see there's an, I think it's there it is up there, 3.5 miles transformed here, developer-led project, partnership with Denver Water. The developer will now care for the entire canal in those areas too. It's designed for stormwater conveyance there. And so then the city of Littleton has also a much smaller developer-initiated project completed in June of 2020. It's a stormwater conveyance project, and it's about a mile of the Highland Canal. So these jurisdictions are learning from these, and you guys have so much now that you can learn from you know, as opposed to 2 or 3 years ago. Here's Josh and myself very, very excited about this project and the water coming in. And it was a cheaper way to address a problem for the developer. So, and then the Southeast Metro Stormwater Authority oversees the stormwater in Littleton and Centennial. Well, Centennial only, right?
And unincorporated.
And unincorporated Arapahoe, yeah. And so this is a developer redevelopment initiated project. The construction, isn't it finished, Josh?
It is now, yeah.
Yeah. Stormwater conveyance, 1.5 miles of the canal transformed. Here we have, one of the things that our organization's distinctly helpful with is actually cleaning out some of the debris. And this is, I think this was led by one of the fire, what was it? Ingar Jensen with South Metro Stormwater, because they're concerned about the fire risk with all this debris in the Highland Canal. So there are a lot of partners that can step forward and support the community in some of these cleanouts. We'll talk a little more about that. The city of Greenwood Village, 2.5 miles, not all of Greenwood Village is in their stormwater pilot. This is stormwater conveyance. You heard Suzanne Moore talking there. Aren't they lucky to have a rec manager that also is a stormwater engineer? They're distinctly, they were perfect to lead this. And if you haven't ever heard her presentation to the city council on why they should do it, you should listen. When it's your turn, you can just copy it. No, I mean, she estimated the costs of caring for other parks, and she did the whole analysis. Here is pre-cleanup. Fred Wolf would like to see this. This is after cleanup. Fred's very committed to, the City and County of Denver Stormwater Project Eisenhower that you heard about in there. It's completed, and this is kind of fun. That's the vault and weir. I think that's the vault too. Yeah, there it is with water in it. It looks a lot better now. It's not as muddy. But this is the type of construction that might go on in a few areas in the village. This might need to happen in the village. I know a few areas where it possibly would. This is a forebay kind of situation where the water's coming down and was just dumping into the canal without any pre-treatment. And so there needed to be, some more filtration of the sediment and so forth in this spot. You can see these down at the dead ends right before you get to the Highland Canal. So on the north side of the canal, in that neighborhood, right in there at Eisenhower Park, if you want to go look. Here it is coming down into the, with the, look at this one's live.
Video.
Let's see. Really exciting, isn't it? Some of these secondary benefits of stormwater management in the Highland Canal were addressed in the video, so I don't want to bore you too much, but I think that this, the canal wet is just the way we want the canal. We don't want it to get dried up. I've seen some of the areas we all have where the canal really doesn't get any stormwater right now, and it's dusty and dry, the trees are dead, it's not a pretty thing. And so if we can avoid it by managing the stormwater in there and even possibly directing more, that's much better for the canal. A vibrant canopy, obviously it improves air quality, sequesters carbon, mitigates heat island effect, environmental health. The stormwater 72-hour hold provides 40% cleaner water. I mean, you're not doing that in the gray infrastructure that's just dumping water into the next place. Improves wildlife habitat. People like to worry about even the debris down the canal. Well, it's wildlife habitat. So, there's a balance there. How much of it can you leave and how often does it need to get removed? Improves community health for all of those reasons. And then the cost savings. We have run some of these numbers. We decided not to share all those with you, but if you wanted to see the actual dollar amounts, that was part of our task that we had from the Pisces Foundation, was to actually monetize these secondary benefits, because that's the way that the world works, is in money. So we have that if you'd like to see it. The next steps are doing what we're trying to do right now is advance additional projects, support jurisdictions that are looking and evaluating. Evaluate the pilot projects for their efficiency, for the maintenance that's going on there, the cost of the maintenance, the capital investment in the infrastructure and so forth. Understand the operations and maintenance. I guess I'm repeating myself, but we have a centralized maintenance contract that I think is a really important thing that's going to lift up this project. So how many miles do we have on the centralized maintenance contract? 7 miles. So, and 4 different jurisdictions? 3.
Yeah.
So they came together with Mile High Flood managing the contract, and the Conservancy is quite involved as well. But so that we could learn what the cost would truly be, we came up with estimates, and I can't remember, Josh will come up here and talk about how much per mile, but that's a really important thing because it reduces the unknown and the fear of the costs of this. Design and access costs in Cherry Hills Village. So I know you're, have you already chosen?
So if Mr. Chair, if I could just piggyback, this would be a great time to supplement everything that's being talked about. So there was that one slide that you had from the master plan, it's quite a bit back, but that showed all the master plan recommendations for capital projects and maintenance for Cherry Hills Village, with the berms, the outfall structures, etc. That's it, right there. It is a great starting point, and it's at a certain level of specificity. For some of these jurisdictions, Denver being a great example, their ability to take on a certain reach, a certain section of the canal for maintenance, it's a different prospect for them than it is for us. Undertaking all of these projects in relation to our overall city budget is huge, or actually our overall Parks and Recreation budget, which is even, it's a much different math, if you will. Knowing that Denver Water, who has, none of this really would be possible if they didn't agree to maintain ownership. It really wouldn't be possible without their agreeing to take over ownership. With that, though, they certainly hope that the jurisdictions, I don't want to say slowly, but surely. How about just surely?
At a point in the future.
They surely want jurisdictions to begin to take over maintenance responsibilities of that. And there are certain benefits for us long-term. We have nearby property owners who will be able to drain instead of having to retain or detain water on their own private property, might be able to release into the canal. It's really the future of the canal, and it has all those primary and secondary benefits that Harriet has laid out here. However, we want to make sure that we are doing this in a thoughtful, well-planned out way. So we are in the process of selecting a consultant to take the next dive down, one layer below what you see here, and really understand the costs of both the capital projects that are contained in here for the water quality berms, overflow, any kind of gates or any other improvements that might be needed, as well as the annual operating costs that Denver Water is certainly hoping that we take on. So that we can then begin to, and the plan that we're going to do is going to include phasing. What would be a logical phasing that allows the biggest bang for the buck, but that also works with our Parks and Recreation budget. So we're hoping to, best case scenario is we do this study and it's not $800,000, right? It's $600,000. And annual maintenance, instead of that being $250, I made this number, I don't know what that number is in the plan.
I think the centralized contract is how much?
Yeah, they say 15,000 per mile per year.
So that would be $45,000 for the central contract. There is undoubtedly going to be some one-time tree maintenance. Tree maintenance is going to be the big number probably, but there's going to likely be some bank stabilization that's required, et cetera. We want to know what those numbers are so that we can plan accordingly. It's such a huge percentage of our overall parks budget that we really need to know what those costs are. You know, I think in conversations with Denver Water, they certainly would prefer for it to be sooner rather than later, but I think they're appreciative of the fact that we aren't just sitting back and saying, well, we'll see. We're trying to get out ahead of it so that we do know what our plan is going to be. So that's really what Harriet's talking about on that last slide as far as next steps. We're going to be kicking that off in 2022, January of 2022.
Yeah, and you know, we're here to, you know, also advise a little bit.
100%, absolutely.
And that there's a couple of key things that I want to make sure that you all understand. And one is that Denver Water very, very much wants this to happen. They want a functional purpose for that canal. They didn't want it to just be a greenway, you know? It was built for a functional purpose. They are retaining their right to run water in the canal through all this, if the water right were in a high enough priority at this point. But with that being said, if I were in your shoes, I would be talking to them a lot right now. It's sort of like first come, first served with this, and we're finding that Denver Water is more amenable to supporting the jurisdictions that are willing to take some risks and move forward first. Because this is, you know, something we're trying to get forward. So if you're the last government to say yes, you may get shoved into things in a way. So just keep that in mind. That's, I think, really important piece. There are incentives that Denver Water has provided to some of those other pilot projects, you know, including some major cleanup of trees and commitment from us to do cleanups within the canal. We have some technical money to support with designs and, you know, public meetings and just different things to make this easier. And then we're also beginning conversations around renewed leases. So I think yours is up in about a year. Is that what we came up with?
Later in 2022.
Yeah.
Yep.
So be aware that this may be part of that discussion. And
Oh,
so,
I don't think May is. I think it will be a part of the discussion.
But again, with a timeline, they understand no one's going to jump in and do this right away. But that timeline will be important. We're strategizing with with our partners and funding partners on how we could create some major cleanups and, you know, tree care projects in advance to try to get more governments to move forward, because that's a big fear, those trees.
100%. And I appreciate you bringing up the lease renewal. So just for the commission's benefit, we actually lease the recreational opportunities from Denver Water for the trail. That lease is due to be renewed. I think it's in October of 2023. Was that right?
Yeah.
22.
Or 2022, I mean.
You're awesome.
Yeah, look at that, okay. The reason our timing for our study is like it is because of our renewal date. So our hope is to be done with that in enough time to give our city council, PTRC, you guys, whoever needs to weigh in on what we think that the results of that plan are telling us. We've got time to have some thoughtful conversations before it's time to make potential commitments in that lease.
That's really smart.
That was the whole idea.
And then one other thing that
Can
many
I
of
just
you
ask a
maybe,
question?
yeah,
When you say city leases the recreational, did you say opportunity?
It's an easement, I believe. It's a recreational easement.
It's a lease.
A lease, yeah. So the trail itself, so there is a small section that we own.
Right.
We're the only, but that doesn't cover all 3.3 miles of our Highline section. For the remaining portions of that, we lease the recreational use of that.
Which essentially right now is the trail.
Is the trail, and I think there's some additional land on either side of it.
It's typically about 6 feet on either side of the trail.
Yeah.
So that's a really important part of this discussion that I think that, you know, a group like yours should understand is that that's the way that most of the jurisdictions' leases have been. They've been recreational leases. And with Denver Water closing down much of their delivery of water, they don't have the use of the canal. They don't have the need of the canal. And so now they're looking at stormwater that's coming into the canal in different ways, lots of different ways, and saying, you know, we're not gonna be maintaining this canal, so the flood risk of your stormwater coming in shouldn't be our responsibility because we're not using it anymore. So we're gonna support you all as you begin to manage your stormwater in the Highland Canal. And also remember that the canal is a continuous, you know, resource. So when Greenwood Village decides to put its stormwater in, and let's say more comes in down in the southern part of Greenwood Village as the years go on, stormwater doesn't get to stop and not come into Cherry Hills Village, and neither is the debris. The debris moves with the water, and then it clogs in different areas. So the jurisdictions that aren't picking this up and kind of taking charge, you're gonna see like down at Dahlia at the trailhead where it makes a sharp turn, wherever it makes a sharp turn, you're just gonna get piles of debris. And so it, as much as it can be done section by section, we're committed and working to try to think about it canal-wide at the same time. And so what can be done canal-wide? We have a fund that Denver Water is supporting us in creating and is committed to putting a significant amount of money in over the next few years as we raise money. That fund will be used for the basic care of the canal. It's not going to cover everything, but it will help with this increased responsibility that the local governments have. Again, they're recognizing it's their land, but it's a balance here. And I feel like, and I'm not paid to say this, but I feel that Denver Water's been an incredible partner for the whole region.
And that's why I agree with you, and hopefully my comments earlier reflect that. It really is, this wouldn't happen, in my opinion, if it weren't for Denver Water agreeing to maintain sole ownership of the entire 71 miles, say for our little section.
It's incredible.
Honestly, none of this would be possible without it. With that said, the liability piece is, I mentioned the phasing, and we want this study to help us understand what the phasing for potential capital construction would be. A big part of my personal motivation for that is that also shifts some of the liability to us. And if we're suddenly liable, I want to know what improvements we need to protect us, and when. That'll probably drive phasing, that and the relationship to the available funds. So once we understand that better, then we'll be able to then have conversations with Conservancy, Denver Water, maybe we can tap into grant funding to help us augment our contribution to those capital funds. But it's not just a single decision point here. We have recreation, we have stormwater, we have benefits to nearby residents, we have liability issues, budget issues. So we're really hoping that this study helps us understand better, so it's not quite so all over the place.
Yeah, we have what's called a pathway guide that we created also that walks through step by step and like you guys, some of you might really become stormwater nerds here and want to read that because that stuff is really helpful, you know, as you're beginning to think about it and the phasing. But we're both here to answer questions. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I'd love to add just one more because we didn't talk about the spillways and the constructed overflows, and I think back to that model slide, that there is already stormwater reaching the canal in the village. And I think that's a really key piece. Some sections of the canal don't have stormwater inflows currently. That's not the case here. And so when you look at the master plan, sorry, it's way back, the stars on the map actually represent locations where in a 100-year storm, and that's what the stormwater managers really use to understand in a major storm event, those stars actually represent spill locations, where the canal is at risk of overtopping and water spilling into those adjacent locations. And so the southern cluster is around the Kent Denver property there and the Blackmore Common, and so you don't have adjacent development. But when you get up to Quincy, you get around Bel Air and Dahlia Hollow, you have two spill locations that sit above the neighborhood there. And so I think the recommendations in the plan, the idea is to mitigate the risk of those overtoppings. And so while the liability may be shared now with Denver Water, kind of constructing the canal as they did, I think the reality there are some real risks to not formalizing the stormwater and implementing some of those recommendations. And so the three green diamonds represent what they call constructed overflows. And that would be where you harden the trail, just a short section where you actually would put in concrete instead of the gravel, so that when the water spills out of the canal, it spills over the trail and then into a location where it mitigates risk. And then the spillway, you have one spillway recommended. That's actually in Three Pond Park. And it's really a neat one because it would spill into the ponds. So So in a 100-year storm, water would spill out of the canal into the series of ponds there. And so you have an opportunity actually for an infusion of water during these storm events. And so those are the kind of 4 additional recommendations in addition to the water quality berms. We haven't seen jurisdictions take on construction of those elements yet, so we don't have the live photos. We have other overflows that we can show from other trails. But I think that's a key piece, that this water is reaching the canal now, and based on the modeling, there are these impacts, and I think the need to dial deeper in the study as well is that where that water spills, whether it's into Quincy Gulch, whether it's into, and I'm trying to remember what it is, that Dahlia Hollow, whatever the gulch is there, I don't know if that's Blackmore Gulch, or maybe in reverse. But there are downstream impacts on then the flooding issues I know that the village has there at Quincy in Colorado, for instance. And so in a 100-year storm with water coming out of the canal, how does that interplay with the other waterways and other flood concerns that you have in the village? So I think it is really smart to look at it more holistically, not just the master plan looked at the canal system and how we mitigate these overtoppings, but you do need to look holistically at the impacts it has on the downstream. And so I think that's something that they can really look more closely at through this study and understand the potential benefits to the tributaries you have in the village.
Josh, I think that was an excellent summary of, I think about and I understand where we're at with this, and it's that kind of discussion that, so the study was my idea at council and they bought off on it, but it's really that. So Alan Lee, the person who put the study together, I'm sure he chose the yellow stars because they look bright and cheery, and you got yellow stars in school when you did well. They, to me, are the scary parts of this map. They are not the cheery, fun parts of this map. And so it's those that really make me want to do this study.
Well, and you also have opportunities. I
Agreed. I don't mean to be too negative, but
as you're bringing water in, the system here is really old, and you need to look, so you have more capacity. You have the ability to use the canal.
Totally agree. It's the more holistic approach.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I have a question. How significant are the benefits to property owners not having to do on-site retention? I know it can be a huge advantage in a new house that's being built. We don't have that many lots left in Cheerios to develop. Could you talk about those benefits a little bit?
Well, I think that's really hard to quantify because we had 2 homes being reconstructed at the end of Mansfield. And we pushed really hard and you guys just weren't ready, which we get. But to have those, Mike, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and to capture some money from those folks and get that water in the canal. Denver Water was willing to take that water without you guys doing any of this, but it was a risk issue and so forth. But there aren't very many properties, and so I think I think that'd be something you guys would have to assess, how many remaining lots there are reconstruction, because when a property over an acre, I think it is, according to the Clean Water Act, is rebuilt, they have a new stormwater responsibility too. So you're going to see some of that going on. I do know, just to give some context to this, that a couple of landowners that spent upwards of $300,000 building detention ponds were in Cherry Hills Village. So those are beautiful detention ponds, but still, it's money. It's real money.
And land that they can't use.
And land they can't use. So I know that the guy, one of the people that was doing it at the end of Mansfield, his cost was around $80 for his detention pond. So you have some opportunity there.
On detention ponds, which one are you talking about? You're talking about Brett Packer's property?
Those 2 properties on the east side of the canal at the end of Mansfield?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One is Brett Packer, the
Okay.
other one
I
is.
don't- Can't remember.
Well, it wasn't most of us. I got a couple of questions. First of all, what's a waste gate?
What's what?
A waste gate.
Yeah, so
A waste gate.
Yeah, natural waterways, Denver Water it's essentially a release valve for the canal. And
Is
so,
that similar to what's been installed in Eisenhower Park?
no, so those are the berms. So the waste gate is what allows the water to flow back into a natural waterway. And so in the Greenwood Village project example, the project ends at Little Dry Creek. And it used to be during a water run, they'd keep the gates closed so that the water would go into the siphon and out the other side. Now, during the stormwater management, they'll actually keep it open. And so the water will go back into the natural waterway and it'll be that 40% cleaner.
So you're classifying the structure in Eisenhower Park just west of Daddy Street as a berm?
That's right. Yeah, and that's recommended about every half mile in the master plan. So you've got 5 of those.
Where are you going to put them here?
So they're the red, what are those, pentagons, I believe?
But they can be moved.
Yeah, and those are the kind of conceptual locations, and I think that the study will really.
What's the one at the north end, where's the location that I can discern the other three?
Let's see, so it's
Looks
past
pretty close to your
Mansfield. Yeah, almost to Covington, yeah, between Mansfield and Covington.
That's up by Covington.
Yeah, in between the two, yeah, it's kind of behind those.
All right, is that the place where they've got the concrete barrier sitting right now?
It's right near there, yeah.
I don't think it's right at that spot. I'm having a hard time being able to
Okay,
tell from
yes,
this.
it's approximate, all right. All right. The inlet filters, this is to improve water quality. What's going to be the frequency of their location?
Yeah, so that's somewhat unique to Denver because they actually have pipes that drain into the canal. And so the inlet filters, it's actually an outfall treatment so that before the water discharges, they're pre-treating the water so that it provides some additional filtration.
How does that apply here in Cherry Hills?
Yeah, you don't have the same volume of kind of piped outfalls, so it may not be as applicable here. Those weren't proposed in the master plan. That was Denver went above and beyond the 4 bays that you saw, and then the inlet filters, those are kind of additional treatment options for water that's coming into the canal to pre-treat.
Because people who are on the uphill side of the canal, water will come off their roof, their lawn, etc. And the ones that antedate the on-site detention, and I can think of a couple, there are instances where they regraded, had everything go to the corner of the lot, and then they stuck a 10-inch pipe, drop in there, 10-inch pipe going straight in the canal. So whatever stuff is on their lawn, and some of these lawns have high quantity of organic content, then goes into the canal. If that water is then detained on the canal, and since I inferred from the video or some of the material that infiltration is desirable here, with some of this organic material or chemical residues or whatever, what's that going to do to concentrations of that stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's oh my gosh, what's the gentleman on the PTRC too? He always asks this question. Yeah, Mr. Eber. I think the reality right now is that there is already these outfalls coming into the canal, and so the opportunity to treat, by formalizing the stormwater, you can look at each of those pipes, an opportunity for something like an inlet filter that could lower actually the amount of those compounds that's entering the canal. So that's, I think, for especially the village, given the amount of existing inflow, a lot of this is already entering the canal. So when folks raise some of these concerns about the impact of some of the salts and street runoff on the corridor, we're already seeing some of that. So by formalizing, you can be more proactive and do some of that pre-treatment. So I think that could actually lower some of the amounts, but it's not baked into that 800,000 within the master plan. So I think that's where the study needs to look at each point of inflow, the amount of water coming in, what might be in that water.
I would assume it's safe to assume that the canal is still going to leak.
Yes.
Which means that this concentrated stuff may go out with it. And some of these leaks, to give you one example, there is a sewer main that goes underneath the canal, just south of Red Patrick's place, near where that last barrier is. And the water from the canal that sits there long enough follows the bedding of the sewer line, and then it lies at the southwest corner of my property is a matter of interest. Now, when the canal, with the canal not running very often, this is not an issue anymore, but there have been years where it has run from May to mid-September. And my concern is if you start getting an increase in the concentration of material, because whatever's been going in there so far, since it's been a flow, yeah, some of it has precipitated out, but now you're not going to let it precipitate out, it's just going to drop. And if contaminated water is then leaking out into adjoining property owners, what's their liability at some future point when EPA decides, hey, we got a big problem here, they say, you've got a contaminated property. Well, wait a minute, it's leaking from the canal. Well, talk to Denver Water. Good luck with that one.
Well, those are things that can be looked at with Denver Water as you guys are getting into your plan. You'll have some leverage, to look at issues like that. But I think one thing that Josh said has been really important for people to understand is that in a community like this, the stormwater in the Highland Canal right now isn't all the water that will be in the Highland Canal. It's not like we're gonna start dumping in all the water from Cherry Hills North, more of it into the Highland Canal until the system's put in place. So the impurities that are coming, like you're saying, from Peyton Manning's house or whoever's house has that pipe, because I just saw one of them right over in that area. There's a bunch of those throughout, but Josh is saying there's now, as this is being managed for stormwater, you have an opportunity to look and test that water and put some, pre-treatment or something in if it's not good, or change your rules about what people that have those inflows can put on their lawns.
Good luck enforcing it.
Well, you guys are the all-powerful
Okay.
commission.
And on the two, so we've actually been partnering with Denver Botanic Gardens, and so they've been in that Eisenhower section doing a plant and soil assessment. And so part of the soil assessment is looking at some of those inorganic compounds and understanding how that changes before the infrastructure is implemented. And they'll be back out next summer actually seeing how that's changing afterwards. And they just got a grant to expand that to 6 different sites along the canal. So that is something we really do want to understand. I think it's both the benefit for the trees and vegetation on maybe the positive side is something that's really important to understand. How much can the stormwater really fuel the regeneration of the canopy? But then I think on the kind of risk mitigation side, really understanding the contamination that's possible out there now, and as more inflows come in, what type of regulation might be needed. So we are monitoring that.
You referred to revegetation of the canopy and proximity of water and how that is a good idea. I wholeheartedly agree. Question or observation first. My guess is that 99% of the vegetation growing along the High Line is volunteer. Now, you can continue to provide water for it, but some of that volunteer stuff isn't real nice material. If you have a proactive program to keep water in that area, how are you going to control vegetative cover? If you get cottonwood there, fine. Ash, who knows? There are plenty of stuff that's nice. But there's also brush and olive and everything else which is on the noxious weeds list of the state agricultural department. How's this going to be controlled? Is this going to be covered by the maintenance contracts?
Yeah, so the Russian olive is actually a really exciting one. We are going to be working with Mile High Youth Corps next year on our first Russian olive removal project. We're doing 12 miles in City County, Denver. We just found out last week, I don't know if we told you yet, that we just got that Conservation Service Corps grant from GOCO to do another 8 miles in Greenwood Village and Centennial. And so we'll be removing Russian olive with Youth Corps, so these are 18 to 25-year-olds doing job training in natural resource management. So that's a program that we think is really fundable, and we'd love to apply for funding to do Russian olive removal specifically through the village.
The village is moving forward on their plan. This is one of the things is we wouldn't do that kind of, mitigation effort here until you guys are clearly, and you're making progress, but we are going to be working with the local governments all across the whole canal because it's one system on a natural resource management plan. And we're already working in smaller areas within weed mitigation, noxious weeds. How many miles?
Yeah, so the centralized maintenance contract does also cover noxious weed treatment they spray. And so that's something we're working to figure out the long-term balance of how much can the volunteers be involved with mechanical removal. But right now they spray, and that's about, it's 2 passes for about 2,300 of that 15,000 per mile per year is to spray for noxious weeds. And that is something that Denver Water has done historically. That's being taken on by the local entities now. And through the centralized contract, we have efficiencies because we have a single contractor that's spraying along the whole canal. So that's another piece. And then the trees, I think, is exciting. We actually this year did our first series of tree plantings. And we're doing a little bit of a different approach. The village just extended an irrigation line from Bellevue, and so that's a neat project that brings in an irrigation line to run parallel to the canal, but on the kind of low side, so not on the canal side, but on that low side of the trail. And so it's running irrigation to water trees. We're experimenting with 2 alternative approaches that are truck irrigating trees. So one is to plant xeric trees, so these are non-native, but trees that will survive with less water. Plant them and then they'll water them for 3 years. And then from there, they'll actually be able to establish on their own, and we'll monitor for that 4th and 5th year with potential additional supplemental. But we are also piloting about 20% of our plantings this year were riparian plantings. So they were box elder and cottonwood. We want to try some willow as well, where we're planting them down near the channel in locations that have stormwater to see if the stormwater is sufficient to establish some of the new desired trees. and we'll truck irrigate for 3 years as well, but then take them off of that supplemental irrigation and see if we can establish new cottonwoods that are the desired male, so that's not producing the cotton, that are also in desired locations that are best for the management of the corridor. So on the planting front too, we are starting to get some data about the establishment of new trees. And so I think in trying to move towards the kind of managed canopy, it is going to be a significant change. I'll say ash is just the last note. There's a lot of opinion with foresters about ash. A lot of the foresters, if the ash trees are less than 8-10 inches in diameter and not in great health, they want to take them out because they don't want the canal to become a vector for the movement of the emerald ash borer that is coming into the metro area. It's the third most prevalent tree along the canal today after the cottonwood and the Siberian elm, which is also not a desired tree by most foresters. So we have a lot of work to do. It's amazing when you add those up. It's 2/3 of the mature trees on the canal are either the riparian trees that are phasing out with less water, or it's the ash and Siberian elm. So I think with larger ash, we are interested in experimenting with some inoculation. And that's something that you can inoculate larger ash trees to the ash borer. And that's something we'd like to pilot. So that's another one on the rec side if the village is interested. If the trees, the foresters recommend 10 inches or greater and in excellent health, it's worth potentially trying to preserve some of the specimen ash trees that are out there in a way that they are then immune to the ash borer as it closes in.
With your comment about Xerox trees, for what it's worth, Denver Water made that observation in the late 70s, early 80s, and one of the trees they recommended at the time was Russian olive. One last question. Have they done any modeling as to the capacity of the canal in terms of stormwater runoff? How big a storm can you take? And how is this going to work if you have barriers in there, so it's not really free flowing? We have had storms in the past, certainly May of 1973, had a pretty good go around in June 2015, where it had major precipitation events. 73 is well documented as how many places it overflowed. And there was a lot less vegetative debris back then because it hadn't grown up as much. Well, what's the capacity? Because certainly the width of the canal, depending on where you are, varies widely. There'll be places, well, as you observed in the bridge across by Dahlia Street, that's a fairly narrow stretch. You get further south, out past Blackburn, etc. You get wider stretches. One of the other things is that when you get these stormwater flows, and I don't know how this would work out with the barriers, but there have been instances in the past where you've either had bank erosion or in some instances where there was a proliferation of trees and there was a constriction of the channel that you wound up with rapids and ultimately cavitation. This occurred, they rectified it about 20 years ago, but there were sinkholes in the canal, some of them were really deep, and this of course lent itself to the leak problem. That in my area, when the canal was running, 80, 90 CFS, the leakage rate at my collection point was 4 gallons a minute, which works out to a fair amount per day. And during flood flows, we've seen it as high as 40, but that's a very rare event. So how much of this is good intentions here, and how much of it is, okay, what if things really go to crap? What happens then? What's the impact going to be on all Cherry Hills with the installation of these barriers?
Well, first of all, they're not barriers, because you can open up the gate.
Okay, and they do have an overflow.
Yes, they're not barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they're designed at just 3 feet off the canal bottom too. So in a small event, they're retaining water. In a large event, that water is going to rush right over the top. I think the key with the capacity is that looking at these spill locations, you would say that in the current condition, the canal is somewhat at capacity in the village. And I think that's where this modeling exercise will be so important, is that with the installation of the constructed overflows and the spillway that's recommended, that's what will alleviate. So I think I neglected to close the loop, that if you install, based on the model, these 3 constructed overflows and that 1 spillway, that alleviates all of these spill locations. So just with those 4 pieces of infrastructure. And then the question is, how much capacity does that create in a 100-year event? And I think that's where a little bit of model refinement to understand how much more room is there now to accept the new inflows from the adjacent properties. Because if a lot of the opportunity here is that new introduction of water from the adjacent developments or redevelopments, most likely, then really how much capacity can you create with the overflows? In some locations, they even recommend raising the embankment as well as one of the strategies to increase the capacity of the canal in locations where, yeah, maybe you have some of those narrowings where the increased height of the embankment would allow you to increase the capacity of the canal.
You could also look at adjacent ponds, like at Quincy, and you'd have to study it, but to see if you could have some additional capacity there. And I think the important thing, so I was saying to Josh, we don't know how much capacity, because this is a living, breathing model. So with each change you make, it changes that modeling. It's not like a static model. And when Greenwood Village changes things, it changes things.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, Denver Water used to be flat like proposed when they were starting to reserve 25, 30 years ago, and it proposed, the stormwater in the canal, Denver Water said, And I think that resulted in part of that Marjorie Perry Nature Preserve, which has a sink in it, which works fine except when they're doing repair work and then it runs all winter, but digress. Will there be any changes to existing stormwater detentions of that nature on an individual basis? You've already covered it, but say from an entire community like Reserve.
Wait, what are you asking? Like if,
Thank you for that.
yeah, I'm not sure what you're asking.
Where you have existing stormwater detention facilities of a quasi-public variety as opposed to an individual one, will there be any modification in the rules which would then allow those quasi-public ones to let stormwater go into the canal, or will they still be bound by the existing rules of present?
We don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think more water can be added to the canal with the new paradigm. The key, though, being where there's capacity. And that's a good last note on the model, is that Harry mentioned it's a living, breathing model. This is managed by the flood district. And so anytime a new development project comes in and says, we'd like to drain into the Highland Canal, one of the first steps in the process is to have Mile High Flood District look at how much new water are you introducing, what's the 100-year surge, and is there capacity in that location in the canal, or would alterations need to be made, such as these overflows and spillways, to allow for that capacity to enable that new inflow. So I think that's the key, is the model it's the answer, and I think the refinement is so crucial to understand what capacity exists and how that can be augmented.
And Denver Water has a lot of historic relationships with different property owners and jurisdictions on different situations. They might have an IGA here or this there, and so we can't, we're not speaking to that.
Yeah.
So I don't, we can't speak to those things, But I think a lot of things are on the table. How's that?
Yeah, and that paradigm, they used to say we don't want to intermingle the irrigation water with the stormwater, and that's the paradigm that's changed, is the canal is open for stormwater where there's capacity, so. Okay.
I have some questions. But more just for my own clarification. With the centralized maintenance contract, the ultimate goal, long-term goal of that is to get everyone on the centralized maintenance contract, all the municipalities and.
Well, we don't necessarily have the goal to bring everyone on the contract. We want it to be an option if it makes it easier for the local governments. There are some jurisdictions that want to do it themselves.
Okay.
Just to be clear.
Yeah.
And to find economies of scale, maybe bring down costs by having more participants.
Okay, thank you. And then just like really high level, what are the lease terms? Are they long-term leases as far as leasing the rec district?
I don't remember our term, do you?
Yeah, I think it was 25 years, so they're pretty significant. The move is to get away from a recreation lease and these stormwater agreements and create one more comprehensive umbrella agreement. And so I think they're really open. If you're willing to commit to that broader kind of management of the corridor, I think they're pretty flexible on the length and those terms.
Some jurisdictions might want to see a very long-term lease because of the level of investment that they're putting into the Highland Canal, and so I think that that's a consideration.
So basically the lease terms are open right now? Are all the leases, do all the leases renew at the same time?
No, they all renew at different times. There's some differences between them, and you know, I think that that discussion is just beginning.
Yes.
You know, it's not like I referenced it because I thought it was only appropriate to reference it, but it's very, very beginning.
Lucky us, we'll be one of the first.
Yeah.
After this more holistic approach is starting to take effect.
Yeah. And so maybe
And
you
lucky
have a
us,
short
well,
term,
fantastic,
maybe
so.
you'd have like a couple year, you know, extension of what you have, and then, you know, it kind of just depends.
Yeah, got it. Okay. And that's negotiated by that's under the purview of the city, and the city's attorney, or is there a subcommittee or Parks and Rec? Is it under Parks and Rec?
Well, it's certainly going to be eventually a city council
Okay.
agreement,
Yeah.
right? But there are certainly going to be recommending bodies that probably look at it, namely PTRC.
Okay. That was the answer to my question.
Yeah.
How many, I'm sorry, remind me how many
Governments,
jurisdictions?
11
11?
governmental jurisdictions are part of the partnership.
Okay, and are all 11, no, the answer is no, because we haven't actively begun any
Yeah.
work. Of the 11, how many have actively?
Isn't it 6, Josh?
Yeah, 6 projects, and we're actually hoping they're in negotiation on their 7th right now. So almost each jurisdiction, I think it's just the village and unincorporated Arapahoe would be the last 2.
What generally is happening is that one of the local governments will find that something's more expensive for them to do if they don't address the stormwater in the canal and get on with it. So that's usually the turning point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been pretty opportunistic.
To clarify, that's just the jurisdictions that are doing the projects. That's not necessarily all the jurisdictions that have agreed to take over maintenance of a certain section.
So the projects necessitate a transition of maintenance.
But just sections, they're not,
Mhm.
like
Not the
Denver's not
whole
doing all
reach.
of it.
Mhm.
Right.
And to that, and because a little earlier you said, hey, you guys get going, you know, people that have their plan in place get kind of first dibs. So those 7 projects, there's a plan, and I mean, what is that
They have
process? There's a plan that's
intergovernmental-
been adopted by the municipalities and then accepted by,
It's been an ongoing, each of those stormwater agreements, they're called intergovernmental agreements, and they're
Right.
with Denver Water and the governmental jurisdiction. We're not signers of that in any way. But those intergovernmental intergovernmental agreements drive the understanding of the management of stormwater in the Highland Canal. And so, in most of those jurisdictions, it's just a portion of the jurisdiction where they're testing it out or, you know, trying to begin the understanding. And the goal with the leases is to bring the stormwater and the recreational relationships over the land to become an overall agreement instead of an IGA and a recreational lease agreement. It's sort of
Okay, it'll
silly.
just be all one.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not
Yeah.
all
Yeah,
one.
and over a period of time, you know, all those concepts built in. Does that help? They're IGAs and they're publicly available.
Mhm. And this map shows 5 of the projects. So this is a little outdated already. There's another, the widening of Santa Fe led Douglas County to accept stormwater in the canal and take on management of another 1.5 miles all the way down to Marcy Gulch. And then Aurora is the 7th. They're looking at a 6-mile section. So that would be the longest project. And as a part of these jurisdictions have taken on then management of the ditch and the vegetation beyond just that trail and 6 feet on either side that's in the rec lease. So the IGAs obligate the maintenance for the remainder of the corridor, but just for these sections. So that's where we're up to that 12 miles and potentially 18 at the end of the first quarter.
maybe Harriet says it, but then, and the parties to the IGAs, it's the jurisdiction, what Denver Water, and then
I can't remember if Mile High Flood signs it. I think they might. You know, on top of that, and you know, it's getting kind of late for you guys, but on top of that, we also have this MOU, which is for the whole canal collaborative.
Right.
So we have another governance structure, as you know.
Right.
And eventually, maybe all this will blend together and it'll all be easier for everyone. But we're definitely in a transitionary period.
So just to clarify, previous to this, to 7 years ago, Denver Water was responsible for all of the maintenance along the canal?
Well, except for the 6 feet on either side of the trail.
Okay.
Yeah, so the jurisdictions, the local governments or South Suburban Parks and Rec, whomever it was that had the agreement would care for that, and then Denver Water would care for the rest of the canal. And you know, their care is diminished as
I
their.
was gonna say, care is a relative.
Okay.
They used to go in, and I think people here will definitely remember, they used to go in with trucks down in the canal and clear cut the sides of the canal, and, you know, people may have thought that those.
A long time.
Yeah,
since they-
but I mean, that was, made people mad too, so, you know, you get all sides of this thing.
This whole proposal, and I forget the acronym of it, it's 4 letters. Has this been tried elsewhere, and if so, is there any documentation as to success or lack thereof?
Which proposal?
The transformation of a long canal to be a stormwater management system, it's my understanding this is the first, you know, of this size. There's smaller areas
Yeah.
where stormwater, you know, you see a lot of green infrastructure in parks all over the place to huge success, like Buffalo Bayou. Green infrastructure, really. I mean, think about it. So it's not that novel, it's just that this thing is so long. This is so long and it's so historic. Yeah.
But each of the, you know, elements, the berms,
Yeah,
the
those are all-
overflows, the spillways, they're all, you know, implemented all over the metro. I was just on Arapahoe and Holly and on the drainage on Sutter, saw the water quality berms and pulled over to get some photos
Yeah,
for more
good.
precedent
Right, and
images.
I'm looking at this in terms of scale.
Yeah, no, I think the irrigation ditch conversion is somewhat unique, and we hope could be precedent setting.
Well, I mean, Ken McKenzie, who was longtime head of, you know, urban drainage, now Mile High Flood, he said, this is a national model, that this is something that could happen all across the country. Where, because there are canals, and there's ditches that are not used anymore, it's land that in some ways has a greater benefit from a recreational perspective even than the stormwater management side. But if you get the water in there, then all of a sudden the green way becomes something much more special than a dried up ditch. You know, so you think about rails to trails, what could this be? It's exciting.
Okay, sorry, one more question for you, 2 quick questions. Where does the Highlands, not the appropriate technical term, but where does it dump out? Where does it,
Go for
where's
it,
the
John.
water?
Yeah,
There's no
so
water to
it's
dump
so
out.
it goes back to the wastegates actually. So the canal, it's almost like 13 different sections. So each time you hit a natural waterway, there's a gate there that would allow the stormwater to empty out. And so you look here, like the Plum Creek project that's down by Chatfield. So this starts at Solstice, the development's here west of Roxborough Park Road. The water goes 3.5 miles and then it will empty out into Plum Creek. And so you can think about it as these like 13 little retention basins, but the canal itself, historically, it ran up to about where the Gaylord Convention Center is, north of Green Valley Ranch. So it was almost to DIA. So it's 71 miles, only about 28 as the crow flies, but
And
as
there
it
wasn't-
meanders.
There wasn't enough water back historically when it got there that it needed to dump anyplace.
Just
But Commissioner Miles, I appreciate the question, because when I first started learning about this, and this conversion to stormwater, I just imagined a large stormwater event. And it just builds more and more volume as it goes down the 71, and I was like, oh my goodness, poor Aurora, is gonna have a tidal wave. Like honestly, that's what I thought. Yeah.
And I think the infrastructure reuse, you know, using
Yeah,
these
that's
gates
right.
that were used to allow water to be discharged out during an irrigation run, and then repurposing that to now be a piece of the stormwater infrastructure, keeping those gates open, seeing that water flow back into the waterway. We're very
Yeah.
fortunate. Yeah, we just moved to this property in Centennial that's on Little Dry Creek. That's an old Denver water maintenance property, and there's a wastegate there. And so now, after a large storm, you can see the water exit the canal, go back into Little Dry. And what an awesome educational opportunity to think about how the water used to be piped over a Little Dry Creek historically. Then in the 20s, they put in concrete siphons and it went under Little Dry Creek. And now the water can actually go into the creek because it's not that irrigation flow, it's the stormwater flow. So it's a really interesting evolution there.
So do we have some champions?
Okay, my last question is for you. What's the time frame on the village study and on the villages?
So in my mind, the reason we are going out, when we're going out now, is because we have the October recreation lease that's gonna be expiring with Denver Water. So our hope is to have, for the most part, the results of the study done, hopefully in May, so that we have the summer to talk with stakeholders, bodies, and city council with what, so that when we then begin those conversations with Denver Water, we are armed with, well, I sure hope we're okay on liability. Instead of that, it's more like, okay, we know we're gonna need to do this, and then my hope, and you guys do not need to weigh in on this, this is my hope. My hope is that our conversations with Denver Water, the proactive work that we've done is gonna buy us some goodwill, and we're gonna say, look, we can't quite take over full maintenance responsibilities of this and this and this until we get, these improvements done. We don't have the budget for that until 5 years from now, and basically hoping that they will work with us in a common sense way, because they see that we're not just trying to delay. We're trying to be thoughtful with it, and given our size compared to some of our neighbors who can absorb some of these costs in an easier way than we can. That's been my devious plan from the start.
But there are,
Keep in mind that no good deed goes unpunished.
I know.
But there are grants, the federal government is sure active in this area, the EPA, there are a lot of grants, and if, smaller jurisdictions don't have the staff to do that, there is the Canal Collaborative, and I think a lot of these groups, if they came together and we had a distinct plan, that there could be some significant funding, because what you don't want to do is, climate change is upon us.
Yes, agreed.
And we're seeing more and more flood, and if these existing 100-year storm areas are not addressed and now they're identified.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that I'm
I
attempting
think your
to.
approach is wonderful.
I'm not suggesting that we want to talk Denver Water into letting us wait 10 years until we build up the war chest. Yeah, we would absolutely pursue all available funding that we could. I just want to make sure that, we have Denver Water, some folks, some nearby residents, Denver First Church of the Nazarene, for example, hoped to drain into the canal. And they contacted Denver Water and said, hey, we'd love to. And Denver Water, appropriately, understandably, came to us and said, they want to drain. We would love to let them drain. All you got to do is sign the dotted line. They weren't that bold, but you know what I mean, right? So I want to be able to have a more thoughtful, rational conversation that's not driven by some external force that I can't control, and that we get to plan out our budget accordingly, and we are reducing liability in a thoughtful way. So that's really the reason for my push to do this plan now.
I think you guys your city manager is right on target with this. And just remember though, that Denver Water, like I said in the beginning, they want this to happen. They're gonna be good partners for you. They're not gonna force you guys to spend money you don't have, but there are some overflows.
Yes.
Oh.
Thanks.
If you wanna come down and do a tour too. Last thing, if you're a stormwater nerd now and wanna come down and do a tour of the reuse of the wastegate, at Little Dry at our offices, it's really cool.
You may have some takers. This has been great. Let me say, I can attest that the cleanup of the canal, just this side of Broadway, is really impressive. And I assume that's you, but it's really, as you go into DeKoven Park.
Oh, yeah.
It's impressive, and I ride quite a bit out there, so.
Well, and we're going to give those kudos to the Southeast Metro Stormwater Authority, who they took on that project along DeKoven, and so they're now maintaining the canal, and I think it's going to be a benefit to the community. When it's not just Denver Water thinking about how they move their water through the corridor, it's really maintaining it for the green infrastructure function, for the recreation function.
And then with the lens of users, instead of just an old utility, what do you want it to look like?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, this has been great. You've captured all of our attention, so we appreciate the time. We're getting into some really fun stuff here.
I know.
Cleaning and code, and then that's.
I think Josh wants to stay for that.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks,
Appreciate your
Josh.
time.
Thank you very much. So with that, now we come to that fun stuff, housekeeping code amendments. Paul, I think you're presenting. Are you going to walk us through this?
Yes, sir.
Are we gonna do this every time now?
What's that?
Housekeeping code cleanup?
No, not every time. But we will bring some of these back periodically. I know we are. Well, first off, congratulations, Chair Lucas. So far, so good. right? All the mics have turned on, and there's been no pitchforks and torches, so you've done well so far.
Well, the lawyer, you don't have a lawyer here, so.
That always makes it or I'll cover your ears. That always makes it better, Bill. But in all seriousness, that was fantastic from Harriet. They're doing such good work with the canal. And so I will try and go through these relatively quickly. They are generally reflective of the study session that we had in June of this year. And so really between that study session and now, we, planning staff, and the city attorney's office have really been working on the specific language. And so that specific language is really what's before you. There's no new concepts from what we talked about this summer. The first amendment, let me back up for just a second. This was included in your packet, but I also wanted to give the visual of how the changes are structured in terms of presentation format for ease of reference for you as Planning Commission. So generally on each of these slides, you'll see a table, and this table was taken from the study session we did this summer that identifies the issue, what the proposed update is, and then what the rationale or what the intent of that update is. And then below that will be the proposed revised specific section. If it's crossed out, that's a deletion. If it's bold, that's an addition. So the First Amendment is really just codifying the fact that discretionary approvals from City Council are done by resolution. Discretionary approvals are things like site plan amendments or conditional use permits, things like that. Right now, the code doesn't necessarily require that, but it's more formal. It's more of a common practice for communities to do it that way, and it also makes it much easier to research either when a property owner reaches out for questions or if staff's doing some research, rather than having to find the exact meaning and the exact motion and all that. You can just search through resolutions, and it's quite handy.
Hey, Paul?
Yeah.
As we go through these, are you going to want us to address each one and just vote the yea or nay, or is this taking them at the end? Okay.
That's a good question.
Chris,
That's
it. Yes.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut your flag up.
No, that's okay. That's a good question. What I would offer is, if you have questions on individual ones, ask them as we're talking about that one. Don't save your questions for the end, but at the end, there'll be one motion for all of them.
Okay.
Unless for some reason you all want to discuss one of them in more specifics or in more detail or whatever. So
also, the audience, both of you, are welcome to chime in if you have anything. So you're in this discussion, let us know. Don't be shy.
The second amendment is really just to create consistency in terms of short-term rentals. Certain sections of the code reference a 30-day period, and this section referenced a 90-day period. The intent in the modernization in 2019 was to go to 30 days, and so this is really just clarifying and aligning the code sections. And on the next slide, you'll see the code section that has the 30-day reference to it.
On that next one, 2.2, I think you need to add an article in front of the word single, because the way it reads right now, a single-family dwelling unit or a guest house, I think you need an article there.
When you're going to have the plural of
Yes.
rentals and units, then you need to add an A.
Yeah.
Correct, that's right. Easy. Good catch.
Yes, thank you.
School English learned at gunpoint.
So this next proposed amendment, the 2.2, again, this is where the 30-day reference came from. But in looking at the language in detail with the city attorney's office, there's reference in this section to accessory dwelling units. The city doesn't allow accessory dwelling units, and so for further clarity, that's being revised from accessory dwelling units to a guest house. 3.1 is one that we talked a little bit about adding some additional clarity to the definition for an accessory structure. Excuse me. And that's shown by identifying what's in bold, kind of the second half of that paragraph there. Gazebos, pergolas, and agricultural or livestock structures where permitted. Those are considered accessory structures where things like swimming pools and tennis courts, when they're not enclosed, detached patios, when they're not enclosed, and built-in fireplace and barbecue grills. We do see quite a few permits for that, and right now those count towards the accessory structure number that folks are allowed to have. And that wasn't necessarily the intent of regulating the number, it's really more intended to regulate an enclosed structure. 3.2, so if we back up to 3.1, there's references in there to a primary structure, but the code doesn't currently have a definition for a primary structure. So in order to have a definition for a primary structure, myself along with Kathy worked to draft this definition for a primary structure.
I assume the lack of references say that facilities like school, city hall, commercial areas are covered by the phrase but are not limited to.
That's correct. Yes, sir. Proposed amendment number 4, again, is to create some clarity. Right now, Chapter 17 has a definition for the master plan that references the 2008 master plan, as you all are aware. We're going through a process to update that. Changing this language would just reference to whatever master plan is adopted at that time and not specific to the 2008 master plan.
And so the Cheerios Village Master Plan, is it defined somewhere that it is in fact the most recent plan adopted by City Council? Or should we have those words in there? Master Plan means the most recent Cherry Hills Village Master Plan adopted by City Council, or is it defined that way somewhere in there, Cherry Hills Village Master Plan?
I don't know what the definition is in Chapter 16, but we could add some language reflective of that.
I'm just saying, does it make sense? I mean,
The term master plan was further addressed earlier on in here, that they pertinent to your question, saying it's the master plan, not with a master plan as of.
right.
Which is helpful.
So then what I'm hearing is some support for adding some clarification about it being whatever master plan is adopted at that time.
Right, it's in effect, right.
Proposed amendment number 5 is really a one-word change. When we do land use applications, the applicant is required to provide a deposit that we used to pay for consulting review of those applications, and it's the responsibility of the applicant to execute that, sign and execute that, not the director. So that's the clarification.
I assume the dash in the third line between attorney and make is a comma strike. We've got a dash there.
In the third line.
In the red line, 3 lines down.
That's correct, yes. It's a removal of that.
And the escrow agreement, it's an actual escrow agreement, so it's actually, the parties are the applicant, the city, and the escrow agent, is that correct?
I'm sorry, say that last part again, I didn't hear you.
The parties are probably the applicant, the city, and the escrow agent, right? Those are the parties to the agreement. Or is it not like a real escrow agreement?
It's not necessarily an escrow in the sense that it's more of a deposit.
So
It's generally between the applicant and the city.
Okay.
There's generally, just because the cost for the projects don't really require they don't really require a true third-party escrow. Escrow more as in a deposit that we can draw on and send invoices if we need to and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so the applicant's gonna enter into an agreement with the city, so
Correct.
the 2 signatories too.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Proposed amendment number 6, again, as part of the code modernization. Previously, prior to the code modernization, the wireless communication facility standards were included in Chapter 16. As part of the code modernization, they were taken out of Chapter 16 and made their own chapter, Chapter 20. And what this does is in Chapter 2 of the municipal code, also gives the authority back to the Planning and Zoning Commission to make determinations as specified in that chapter related to wireless communication applications. Amendment number 7 is one we talked a little bit about in September, in the summer, if you recall. Right now, the code is silent as to whether or not quote-unquote accessory structures are allowed on lots without primary structures. The historic practice of the city is that we've allowed and we've permitted those. And so this is an effort to codify what we've done historically and moving forward, what was generally supported by the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council as well, by putting some additional parameters on there. One is that the two properties are owned by the same person, that the lot with the principal structure is being used for a residential purpose, so this would not apply to churches or things like that. And then 3, that there's some version of access, whether that's via car or via a walking, not trail, but the ability to walk from one property to another. So those would be the 3 criteria that would be met in order to have an accessory structure as previously defined without a primary structure.
Okay, this one really has me damn particularly the table 16-3-10.c2. All those table notes. Not to disparage anybody's intentions here or anything, but if somebody asked you to draw a picture of this, could you do it? Because I sure couldn't.
Draw a picture of?
Draw a picture incorporating the intent of all these notes. Give you a plan. You arbitrarily select a lot and say, okay, apply all of this to this lot. What will it show me?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Okay.
It's in the table notes he's referencing.
We're in the table at the second half of page 7.
Mm-hmm.
That bottom table there, where you have 6 table notes. Okay, and the first one is adjusted lot area is the lot area plus the area for all adjoining lots of rights of way, etc. If somebody gave you a lot survey, here at Cherry Hill, and say, draw on this piece of paper, give me a depiction of what all of these notes mean. You know, where are the setback lines, where's the wall-plane line, etc. Because as I read through this, I wouldn't know where to begin. I wish I'm not in the business, but still.
Yes, and I think Ethan would agree, we deal with this reality quite frequently when we get building permits in those areas that are zoned the R3A. To your point, could it be formatted and spelled out a little more clearly? Yes, absolutely, we would agree with you on that. But we do get permits and have to use this table.
Well, one of the things too is that these footnotes, you wouldn't apply them all. They only apply to, and you don't have the whole table here. So you don't even know where these footnotes, you gotta look at the table to find out where the footnotes apply.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so then when you do, you realize, okay, number 4 applies to this, whatever that piece of the table is, and so that it's clear, at least it's clearer what it applies to, but all the footnotes wouldn't apply to one situation.
And I mean, absolutely going back to a time where you had setback requirements, and that was pretty much your restriction. You got a rectangular lot, you draw in the setback lines, and you were done. But when I see all this stuff, my eyes start to frost.
When I read this, I'm like, shit, I don't know what the hell this is. I mean, so I went in there sorry. I went in there and looked at the table because I didn't know what this was. I mean, I was confused like you were, so I had to go look at that to find out what it is.
So just to help clarify this, so if you recall before the code modernization process occurred, all of these standards were not consolidated into one place, but were instead spread out throughout each zone district's bulk standards. So R1 had a bunch of these requirements in it. R2 had separate, but sometimes overlapping requirements.
Right.
So there was a lot of redundancy, but sometimes some specificity for each one. One of the primary driving goals of the code modernization was to simplify the code so that you didn't have different requirements spread out throughout, that you had to then, the user, the reader would somehow be forced to go find. How would you know where to look? So the idea was to put it all in one place. So all of these notes, and we should clarify which ones are actually being proposed to be changed, because a lot of these are not, these all existed prior. They're actually a godsend, because they're there to clarify when you are going through the exercise of trying to draw the lots or decide where to put your building or whatever it might be. Without these clarifications, the applicants have no clue. They don't know because the code's not clear, and they end up calling Ethan, and Ethan's like, well, I'm reading the same thing you are, I don't know either. These notes all came through a series of heartache and bad scenarios where they were like, well, we got to clarify this to give applicants more and staff more clarity. So the reason they're all listed like this in a somewhat awkward way was an attempt to actually simplify it over the even more awkward way it was presented before the code modernization took place. Clear as mud?
Changing today is just what's in bold.
Correct. And they've been there like that for years.
Right.
In the code modernization, it's just got reformatted to be put in one spot. And so what's before you tonight is just the last part of what's in table 10-3-10.c.1.
Yeah, there's no changes to the proposed notations. This is in addition to those proposed notations.
This is another one of those examples where we've had heartburn that we need to provide some additional clarity to help everybody through the process.
And again, you didn't reproduce the entire table, so
Correct.
you're only looking at certain sections of it, which really, like it really, I had to go back and look at it to make sense of it.
Yeah.
So let me ask.
We approved those tables when we approved the code modernization.
Correct.
Right. So, and I appreciate this. This is great feedback. So in the future, moving forward, it would be desirable if a table or a section is being amended, the entirety of that is provided and not just kind of a Cliff's Notes, if you will, of a table.
Or you know, if you didn't want to kill a few more trees, just go back and say, hey, look at this in conjunction with the municipal code.
Okay.
Because some of those are pretty long.
Sure.
No doubt.
We'll get to one that's like that in amendment number 10. But sincerely, I appreciate that feedback because that look, I want to give you guys information that you can understand and digest and we can discuss. So I appreciate that feedback.
So you have your boldface on the top half of page 7. Is that replicated on page 8?
Correct.
For the same intention?
That's correct.
Okay.
So, one question I have, down here you say, under number 1, it says owned by the same property owner with a shared property line. So, I own a property at 4700 South El Camino Drive. The owner owns a lot across the street that he uses as a garden. And it doesn't have shared property line because you have a street running through it.
Correct.
Is that going to disqualify them?
Yeah, so you might recall the last time we had this conversation in the summer, there was some concern about an unconnected property where somebody may build a pool and turn it into like a de facto, remember that conversation you guys had? The street, I think we even mentioned it briefly, that would not be allowed in the future.
Okay.
Right.
So that one would still get to operate as is, no problem. It's allowing it, it's providing that, because there are all of these crazy scenarios, without this additional guidance, these guys they're interpreting all the time, that's not their place. right? And so we're really trying to help everybody out by providing more clarity.
So anybody who's already has a use will be grandfathered into their use. It would just be going forward on a vacant lot.
With one clarifier.
Sell it, is that grandfathered?
With as long as it's legal, as long as if there was an illegal use or illegal structure, that's a different conversation. But if they got permits for it and if the use is allowed, then the answer is yes, it would be grandfathered.
But if they sold it and somebody was tearing it all down, then they would have to reapply, right?
Right, true.
Yes.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
correct.
and then they would not be able to, if it was across the street.
Yes.
If they
Correct.
sold the two lots together.
Correct.
And they scraped.
Yes.
Let's say they have a gazebo over there and they want to scrape it and put it in a pool, then at that point they wouldn't be able to do that.
Thanks.
And then, just for clarity, this is the amendment 8.1 is another one where not the entirety of the table is provided, just the sections that are relevant for what the amendment was. And this 8.1, prior to the comprehensive update in 2019, there was explicit language in there that talked about horses and the ability to have horses in the R1, R2, R3, and R3A zone districts with certain size requirements. And this is just returning that language back to the code. So. And then, again, as we got into the details with the city attorney's office, there's a definition within the code currently for agricultural livestock. And within that, there's a reference to animal husbandry, but there's no definition for animal husbandry in the code. And so this is a new definition that would be added to clarify what that means. Proposed amendment number 9, this references within our chapter 18 of our code, folks that are doing new single-family home construction or certain additions above certain percentages or second stories, they're required to conduct a neighborhood input meeting. Those were primarily done in person before COVID. Once COVID hit, those were nearly exclusively done virtually, and the code didn't give us specific authority to hold them virtually, and so this language would give the ability explicitly to allow us to hold those virtually. And based on feedback we heard from Planning and Zoning Commission in June, the discretion as to who gets to determine whether or not it's person or virtual is held with the director, and additional clarity that you have to have it all in one format or the other, no mixing. So this is proposed amendment 10, and this one has several slides to it. I'm not going to go through each detail on each slide, but I will highlight some things on the different slides. So right now, the code has different notification requirements for different application types, and that's confusing, one for applicants, but two for owners that are receiving notice, especially when you start to get into sister applications or applications more than one. Think of the Denver First applications where there were 3, and a property owner gets 3 different notifications and it's confusing to them, or the distance of who gets noticed is different, and so somebody across the street doesn't get a notice from somebody who does, and so it just creates confusion. And so what this amendment is intended to do is 2 things, is set one set of notification requirements, and 2 is have those notification requirements in one place in chapter 16. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. And unlike the others, these tables are in full. So again, this is the table that discusses the different types of public notification, reduces it to one standardized set for publication, posting, and mailing. Those 3 types are not changing, but they are being aligned consistently in terms of how far in advance and what the distances are for who gets notice. And then table D in this section, this is the first half of that section. It's really aligning the types of notification with the revised types of notification, if that makes sense. So it's better to provide an example. Like the first line there, conditional use permit, it has a publication one, posting one, and mailing two. So this just
all three are required, right?
all three are still required.
So
It's
the
just,
question is, you know, because it doesn't say or, but it also doesn't say and nowhere in there does it say you've got to do all three of these. So the question is, are we concerned that if it says, you know, publication, PO, ML, hey, I get to pick and choose, and someone might argue that, hey, it's all three. Because I couldn't find anywhere that it said, you gotta do all three of these.
Well, I guess I would argue that D states that they've got to do all three. It doesn't say all three, it doesn't use the words all three, but it says required public notice by application type. Sets out the notices that are required at each state of processing.
Rob, I just wanted to raise it. Sometimes I raise things and everybody's good with it. I'm good with it, but that was just one thing that I saw. And obviously Kathy was good with it, so.
And let me just chime in, because I don't want to talk anymore. The one thing I do want to highlight with this, I think this is not an attempt to reduce or limit public input. Every choice that was made to get rid of public notice was the shorter duration. So we kept the longer durations to maximize opportunities for public input. So this is not some sort of, just in case there's anybody in the public that was concerned that this is an attempt to reduce, it is not. It's the reverse of anything.
and then specifically on the second half of that table, references to the subdivisions and the notification requirements for subdivisions. Right now, there's no reference to that in Chapter 16 because Chapter 17 is the subdivision regulations. But when you look at notification types, we want them all in one place for the reasons Chris was talking about with those notes on the previous amendment, because we want one place for folks to go to know what the notification requirements are so that there's no confusion and no error in giving notice to the public. And then the next series of slides here are really illustrative of what is changed based on the proposed change to the notification, and then how that impacts subsequent language within that section. And I do want to take.
And I've got some comments about all of that. It's kind of a broader general one.
Okay.
And I apologize, this is kind of the attorney coming out of me. It's references, it says, at the public hearing required by these sections.
Mm-hmm.
None of those sections talk about a public hearing. There is no, and I looked, there is no reference to a public hearing with regard to what those notices are doing. I'm just saying, it's a minor, it's kind of probably more technical, but it doesn't reference that.
Which specific section says that?
Everyone we say, at the public hearing required by Table 16-2,
Right, so that's no big
public hearing, in accordance with. None of those tables discuss and talk about a public hearing. They talk about
a public notice by application type.
Right.
They don't necessarily.
So somewhere in there, it seems like, and again, just say the hell with it, but
No.
But the point is that either A, there's something in there about a public hearing with regard to what the notice is about, or otherwise you'd add something in here.
My recollection, and Chris is looking this up, is that the code, in the procedural part of the code, says what needs a public hearing and what doesn't need a public hearing. So in a different section of the code, there's a table that says, right? Is that
Yeah, I'm looking it up. I think he's right though.
Yeah.
I'll find it. You guys keep going, and we'll circle back to this one.
Okay.
So we, what we can do is have a conversation with Kathy and see if it makes more sense to reference that table, or.
You know, I'm probably being too picky, but I mean,
No, but-
typically when something goes back and sits back and says, hey, you're gonna do X in accordance with Y will discuss and talk about what X is. And in this case, it doesn't unless you can find it. And if you can, if there is I was thinking, go back and read the whole code. I mean, you know, and I kept wondering, I wonder if there's something somewhere else in another section that sits back and talks about public notices, Because the purpose of a public notice is to give the public notice that something's gonna happen.
That there's an application,
At the
yeah.
end of the day.
Yeah.
And it's a reasonable inference to say, and to let you know when there's going to be a public hearing to talk about it. But it doesn't say any of that, but maybe it does somewhere else.
Yeah, let me keep looking.
I don't know if I'm making.
Yeah,
you guys think
yeah,
so?
well,
A public notice doesn't necessarily mean it's a public hearing.
Right,
You
that-
could give a public notice of a lot of different
That's-
Sure.
That,
Yeah, that's the problem.
We were just, Commissioner, or Chair, sorry, that's gonna take me a couple meetings. Chair Lucas and I were just having a conversation earlier that, what we're doing right now is legislative and not quasi judicial, right? And there's a difference there in that if people speak, that's not necessarily public testimony, right? This is legislative, and so it's not a public hearing, it's a meeting open to the public and the public can speak, but it's not a public hearing. I feel like there should be Jeopardy music in the background.
You guys should keep going. Keep going through slides, and we'll come back to this one.
All right.
So, like I said, these next series of slides is really chapter 17 and the updates to that. Again, these sections talked about public notice for these different application types. Well, those public notification are now in chapter 16, and so this language could be removed. Again, no authority is being changed or taken away from either planning and zoning or city council. It's really just referencing the revised section of the codes. And then the 11th Amendment, and again, we'll circle back to that Amendment 10, but proposed Amendment 11 is simply correcting a spelling error in this section of the code where it currently says follows, changing that to follow.
You might it would be good to, if you are going to add language to the master plan definition, get agreement on that so that can be voted on tonight. If you need to add a word or two to that, buy me a second.
So for those that didn't hear, Chris's suggestion was to go back to amendment number 4, which is the master plan, and discuss some specific changes to that potential language. Just to get, for purposes of getting the conversation started, something to the effect of master plan means the currently adopted version of the Cherry Hills master plan.
Sounds good to me.
Thanks.
Okay.
So, within chapter 16, under article 7, development review process, division 4, specific review provisions, there is a series of individual sections.
I'm going to pull it up.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Purpose and application of division, which is sort of an overarching thing. New residences or expanding of existing residences, site plans, conditional uses, major special events, sign permits, temporary use structures, major home occupying permit, rezoning. Basically, it goes through and has different sections for each one of those. And so it is, or 16, yeah, any one of these. Here, pull up 16.7.325. That's a good one, for example.
325?
That, yeah, or rezoning, which is 350. Yeah, 350 is a great one.
355 is where you're.
350, 16-7-350. There it is. There you go. So I don't know if you can read that or not, but rezoning under B, Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation, all applications for rezoning shall be referred to and considered by the Planning Commission at a public hearing. So, again, I think that as we go through these, that's where this gives quite a bit of guidance on each specific application type. So, for example, a text amendment, which is heard by you and voted on by City Council, is not a public hearing. Just by way of example. We know that because of what it talks about in here for text amendment. So, I think the guidance is provided through, and if you look on the left-hand column there, you can see all the different application types. I think that's where we talk about all the different guidance about what is and is not a public hearing. So the section that we were talking about is providing guidance for notice of the various processes, not necessarily what type of meeting it is. This is where you find that information.
But I can see, to Commissioner Holland's point, like if you look in the text for section 17.320,
Right. Yep.
hereby at the public hearing required by that table. That table isn't specifically requiring the public hearing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, see, some another, and again, I'm never, don't ever take my word for anything, but just to give you an example. If you sat back and said, notice of the public hearing shall be provided in accordance with the
Yeah, I see what you
public
mean.
notices
Yeah.
spelled out in whatever.
Yes, agreed.
Because it's something to insert it from what, you gotta.
To disconnect it really from
Yeah,
what the
it's
requirement is,
disconnected.
I would agree. That makes sense.
It would just be in accordance with Division 4 or Section 16 or something
Well,
like
you
that.
could just say Chapter
Not
16.
table.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, just something that,
Yeah.
No, that, yeah, we can do that.
you know. And again, just my apologies, but I mean, it's like, it's been this way, it's been written, the code's been out there for a long time. But anytime you
Yeah,
take the time to make a change, that's the time to sit there and go, yeah, let's fix that thing, it's been sitting there forever, right?
100%, absolutely, and that's to the point that earlier to kick off this meeting is it's a part of responsible code management to do this type of stuff, to make sure that our codes are aligned. There's as little confusion as possible, and so when we open these up, that's why we like to do this, is to make sure that our code is consistent, and to have these conversations to make sure that we are actually saying what we think we're saying. Now I've got this
Okay.
all messed up for you.
So to allow this to be voted on, I would recommend that the motion maker include an amendment to what's in the packet that clarifies the multiple times that's referenced in what you're voting on.
And it could be referenced to move to approve, blah, 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 with amendments to proposed amendment 10, clarifying references to what sections of code require, state the applicable process for an application.
And then that way, that would allow us to make those changes per your direction to take to city council without having to pull that aside and bring that back to you in January. If that makes sense. If that's what you want to do, you certainly can, but.
And on page 15, there's two lovely write-ups of a proposed motion. If anyone wants to make one.
As well as the attorney.
Well, that's,
Alternative motion.
so would it be,
It's something to the effect of, and
how about this? I move to approve the proposed text amendments to chapters 2, 16, 17, 18, and 20 of the Cheerios Municipal Code as presented in the staff report submitted to the commission, dates December 14, 2021, subject to the following amendments.
Yes.
One of which was, what was the wording we wanted to use for proposed amendment number 4?
Do you have those, Ethan?
master plan means the currently adopted version of the Cherry Hills Village Master Plan.
Okay, so that's in there. And then, and amendment to, amendment 10, what do you want to use there? I mean,
Amendment 10, creating additional clarity in references to what sections of the code require public hearing.
oh.
So,
Do I have a second?
Second.
I know.
Any discussion?
I hate to do this to you guys, but I just looked up the definition of escrow, and it does require a third party management of an escrow account, so.
In our definition or in the Webster's?
In the Webster's dictionary.
So-
Well, the only point is, if you're gonna do an escrow, you need to have a third party. Or you should call it something different.
That's why I asked, is it a real escrow account?
It is not a real escrow account. It is a term that all of our builders and contractors know and I don't want to say love, but are familiar with because it's the term that somebody adopted decades ago to be used that way in this jurisdiction.
In this jurisdiction.
In this
Yeah, I'm
jurisdiction.
just saying, it could get you in trouble if there's a disagreement and you don't have a third party managing that account.
Well, considering that we don't have Kathy here, I would suggest that we add that to the list for next year's housekeeping to research because we will receive, it'll just cause a lot of confusion if we suddenly change the name of that. But anyway, let us look into that.
Just an observation.
Sure.
I'm not saying anything needs to be changed.
Yeah, we'll look into it next time.
But we do put things like that on our list of housekeeping amendments, and that's appropriate for that, and we'll add it to that list and research it.
Good catch.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Is there any other discussion on this? Okay, we can go with a voice vote, so my notes say. So all those in favor of this motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So it passes unanimously. Right, we got through that. Well done, very well organized, so thank you, Paul.
Yeah, and to that point, if there's suggestions or ways that it can be, it's code, right, so it's gonna be dry and it is what it is, but if there's better ways that you all would like to see certain things, let me know that offline and we can do that.
Maybe more Adderall. Okay, reports? Are there any?
Any from commission?
Any from the commission reports? Any from staff after that?
No updates, just, I don't know if we'll get the chance to do it since this is running on here, but if we don't get the chance to talk to you, enjoy your holiday season and make sure you spend some time with friends and family. It's a good time of year to make sure you take time for that, so.
Likewise, you guys as well.
I did want to clarify one thing real quick. I'm sorry, and I know it is getting late. Commissioner Wyman and I did have an opportunity to discuss earlier, and I know that we got a call about this earlier today about focus groups that have been occurring in the city, and there have been, you may have seen social media posts asking for volunteers to be members of a focus group. That is not connected to the master plan process that you're going to be talking about tonight. That is connected to an exploration that City Council is doing regarding should they or should they not consider potential ballot measures to explore some potential tax changes. So the focus group is really specifically about that, not necessarily about this master plan or any other specific thing like the Highline or Quincy Farm or anything else. It's more about potential tax changes. That's really the purpose of that. So I just wanted to, in case you get similar questions, I totally get how we got a lot of feedback that we're trying to get from the public right now, and it can get confusing about which one goes with which project.
Perfect, thank you. Any other? You're adjourned.